A really warm welcome to everybody on this, what is a beautiful clear day in Scotland. Long may that last. So nice to see so many familiar names pop up in the screen. I've been chatting with quite a few of you about this launch event coming for some time, so it's finally nice to be here. And I'm very much looking forward myself to sitting back and hearing some of the fantastic speakers that we have coming along today to showcase the work that's happening across Scotland. So I'm going to start with a few slides, just a short introduction, because I'm not the person you came along to listen to today. We have our lineup of speakers in front of you on the slide. We're going to have Rachel Richards from Buglife, who's going to talk to you about beelines and managing green spaces for pollinators in Scotland. We then pass over to Jim Jeffrey from NatureScot, who's going to talk to you about delivering for pollinators across the country. We have Carol Maclean from Glasgow City Council, who's going to talk about our Glasgow pollinators today. And she will then hand over to Claire Pumfrey from Buglife, who's going to talk about some of Buglife's work up at Strathmore beelines. And last but not least, we have Becky Plunket from West Lothian Council, who's going to talk you through some of the fantastic work happening in West Lothian beelines. Next slide, please, Amy. So just by way of a quick introduction for those who are not familiar with our organisation. So Buglife is an invertebrate conservation trust. So it's the only organisation dedicated to the conservation of all invertebrates and their habitats. So we have some main programmes and activities included in what we do. We have our beelines, which you're going to hear more about today. We also have species recovery programmes that focus on some of our more precious species that are maybe needing a little bit more support. We also have mapped out our important invertebrate areas across the country. If you want to learn more about that, you can go onto our website and see how our mapping is progressing. We also work on site protection, and we have a fantastic group of team for advocacy policy. And a lot of what we do across all of our work involves outreach and engagement. And a key part of all of it is working in partnership, an integral part of what we do. And we're always interested in having discussions about how we can do that together. So some of key things that we want to achieve from all of our projects is to make room for invertebrates, to make it safe for invertebrates, and also to make it friendlier for invertebrates, have a more positive public profile and be better understood. Next slide, please, Amy. So part of the materials that provided for this will go through a little bit of the legislation and policy, so you can go on to this and read in a little bit more detail. But as you can see, there's quite a list here of legislation and policy to give you some guidance and help you understand the laws around this. So we'll start at the top with our Scotland's Biodiversity Strategic Framework. So this is to guide efforts to protect and enhance biodiversity across the country. And it houses both the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy and the recently introduced Environment Bill. Oh, lost our slides. I'll keep going. Our Scottish Biodiversity Strategy outlines a commitment to protect at least 30% of the land and sea for nature by 2030. With the Wildlife and Natural Scotland Act of 2011, it requires us to report on our progress with the strategy every 3 years. Moving on to the Conservation or Nature Habitats Regulations of 1994, this secures compliance with the requirements of the EU Habitats and Wild Bird Directives. Moving on to the Planning Act of 2019, in which local authorities must integrate environmental considerations into land use and planning decisions. Within this, we have our NPF4, our National Planning Framework 4, which has within it designed to help secure positive effects for biodiversity and nature recovery. Moving to Climate Change Scotland Act of 2009, which requires Scotland to have its own adaptation plan, or SNAP 3, which is Scotland's National Adaptation Plan 2024 to 2029, sets out these actions for addressing climate change. And within that, it states that nature connects us across our land and sea. Network supports biodiversity and provides shelter from extreme weather and changing conditions. Moving on to our pollinator strategy for Scotland, we want to make Scotland a place where pollinators can thrive. And on a more local level, our local biodiversity action plan, so making sure that where we live is also a place where pollinators, in fact, all invertebrates, can live and indeed thrive. So all together again, making Scotland a place where there's room for invertebrates, where it's safe for invertebrates, and where it's friendly for invertebrates. If you want to expand any more of the information, it will be in the materials that we provided as part of this launch. So please do go and have a look through them. And following from this launch, we will be looking at having another event where we can get together and continue these conversations. Remember to put all your questions on the chat if anything comes up, and we'll have it open for discussion at the end. So that's enough for me. I would now like to hand you over to Rachel Richards.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to share my slides. 1 minute. Okay, can you see that? I'll take that as a yes, Amy. Brilliant. Okay. So I'm Beeline's officer for Buglife, and I'm going to talk about managing green spaces for pollinators. Let's move on my first slide. 1 minute. There we go. So my basic talk structure today, I'm going to speak initially a bit about the importance of pollinators and who our pollinators are, the problems that they're facing, about beelines and how it's a solution, and then briefly onto the new guidance resources that we've produced and where they can be found. And from those resources, 6 key actions for local authorities regarding pollinators. So the value of invertebrates, of course, they have their own intrinsic value. We all love at this time of year seeing our first bumblebee buzzing through a meadow, or in the summer being out somewhere that's just full of beautiful invertebrates. But they also provide really important ecosystem services. So pollination, as we're all aware, also integrated pest management. So having that right balance of predator and prey species, so that species don't become a pest or a problem. And of course, they're food for other wildlife. They're the base of the food chain. So where you have an abundance of invertebrates, the birds, the mammals, the reptiles, the amphibians, all of those creatures will be doing well as well. And they also help to improve soil. So in terms of nutrient recycling, water use, aeration, and then reducing the need for inputs in farmland, helping with things like flood alleviation. So in terms of pollination, 8 out of 10 wild plants need insect pollination. So if we want those wildflower communities healthy, we need the pollinators. 1 in 3 mouthfuls of our food depends on pollination. If you're eating a good balanced diet, that is, lots of fruit and veg. And there's a monetary value there as well. So 84% of EU crops rely on insect pollination. And in the UK, the figure is 691 million. So wild pollinators, so not just bumblebees and honeybees that can be brought in for pollination, but having a wild diversity of wild pollinators can increase the yields, the crop production stability, but also the quality and the value of the crop. So who are our pollinators? This slide just represents the main pollinator groups. So you've got a hoverfly there, top left. That represents all the flies. There's around 7,000 fly species in the UK, around 270 hoverflies. Solitary bees there in the middle. You can see that bee is covered in pollen. They're quite messy pollinators. So as they're moving between plants, they're transferring a lot of pollen. We've got solitary wasp there, top right. So they're predatory, but they're feeding from flowers. So when they're visiting flowers, they're transferring pollen. And then our butterflies and moths, they might not carry a lot of pollen, but if you get a lot of them in a meadow, you may well get a lot of moth species moving between different plants, accessing those deep flowers. And then we've got our bumblebees, bottom and middle there. And they're big, hardy bees that can cope with the cold weather and keep moving and travel long distances, 1 or 2 kilometers. And again, they're messy pollinators, so they're carrying lots of pollen around. And then, of course, our beetles, again, often predatory or just meeting on flowers to gather, but they're also feeding from flowers and they're also transferring pollen. So all of these invertebrates, over 4,000, at least 4,000 species in the UK, are contributing to pollination. So what about the problems that they're facing? So the State of Nature report 2023 found 33% of the insects, the invertebrates studied there, were declining in distribution. And again, another study in 2017 to 2022 found 1/3 of the insects studied out of 353 species to be declining. And 80% of our butterflies have declined since the 1970s. And we've lost 20 bee and wasp species in the last century. So these are worrying statistics that we're aware of. And in addition to that, there's been effects on abundance. So Bugs Matter is a study that Buglife and Kent Wildlife Trust have led on based on the windscreen phenomenon. So when we were younger on a hot day, and still in some areas, your windscreen might be covered with splats of insects in the summer months, but we're finding that that's decreasing. So this is a study that anyone can take part in. It's a citizen science project. There's a phone app that you can use. You clean your number plate, you start out on a journey and start the app. And at the end of the journey, you take a photo of the number plate and count the number of splats. And we have historic data from 2004, which we are then using to compare with different parts of the country and just to see how our invertebrates are doing in terms of abundance. And sadly, we are experiencing big overall declines. That's not to say that's what's happening necessarily everywhere, but that is the general sense that there are large declines. So 78% decline between 2004 and 2023. And that was the previous year, it was a lower decline. And then this is a German study that you might be aware of. So in 2017, a study of German nature reserves, so areas that are being managed well for invertebrates, you'd have thought, still experiencing there a 75% decline in abundance. So there are species that are being affected and there's abundance that's being affected. Of course, there are some species that are spreading, moving north with climate change and doing well, but the general picture is declines, sadly. So what is the problem? We've lost 97% of our species-rich wildflower habitat in the last century, largely due to intensification of agriculture, chemical usage, but also fragmentation of the landscape. And there's too much untargeted diffused delivery. So we have some wonderful areas of habitat, designated and protected sites, but often they're not connected and they're not connected in a targeted way. And often poor management of public green space as well. So this is a park in North Wales in the summer, and you can see in a hot, dry spell, it's just very short. There's no habitat there for wildlife. So obviously it's good for ball games and picnics, but you could easily have a few meters of long, flowery habitat around the edges. So we need more, bigger, better, and more connected areas for wildlife. That was found in the Making Space for Nature report. So a solution. We need to make our landscapes work better for pollinators and wildlife. We need more permanent, connected, flower-rich habitats like the images you can see there. We want to increase the size and the quality of these habitats and use a mosaic approach as well. That heterogeneity is really important for invertebrates. And yeah, diverse habitats as well. So it's the meadows, it's the scrub, it's the flower-rich hedgerows, it's the wetland features. All those habitats are really important. We want to make the landscape more permeable. By that we mean connected, so that small invertebrates like solitary bees that maybe only travel a couple of 100 meters from the nest site can move through the landscape. If one area is damaged, it can later be recolonized from neighboring sites, but there need to be neighboring sites. So bee lines. Beelines is a network of 3-kilometre wide corridors connecting the best remaining areas of wildflower-rich habitat, and it's been mapped across the UK. It's a shared map, something that we have on our website, but that anyone can contribute to, and it's there to help reverse the pollinator declines. So it's something that anyone, local authorities, businesses, homeowners, schools, can all contribute to by doing their bit for pollinators and adding it onto the website, onto the map. So it was mapped around the table, county by county, with local experts. It was a very data-led exercise. We worked with Liverpool University in terms of the best way to map. And it's looking at the most effective way to restore stepping stones of habitat. So within that 3-kilometre wide corridor, that's not likely to be solid habitat in most instances, but rather stepping stones of habitat connecting up areas. So the main guiding principles in each county of the UK, we have an east-west and a north-south corridor. That north-south corridor is to help with things like the northerly movement of lots of species with climate change. We're wanting to create a continuous network of connected habitat, aiming to fill 10% of beelines with stepping stones. We want to encompass the best and the majority of the flower-rich habitats, especially things like flower-rich grassland. And larger areas are better where possible, so greater than 2 hectares has been found to be an optimal size. And of course, it's not just for pollinators, so anything that's good for invertebrates is going to be good for mammals, for birds, for reptiles, for amphibians. So where are we at now? So in December 2024, we had over 3,600 dots on the map. And of course, there's a lot more work that isn't on the map. And that's 490 dots in Scotland, and over 4,600 hectares of wildflower work captured on beelines, with 384 hectares of that in Scotland. So these are the new guidance resources that we've produced, and they can be found on our website under beelines. We will provide links in the email after this to all these resources. So the benefits of beelines to local authorities covers the legislation, the reasons why we need to be doing more for pollinators in our green spaces in terms of the way that they are managed, the connectivity and the increasing those areas that are managed well for pollinators. There's a resource on managing road verges, another one on managing parks and green spaces, and one that can be given to community groups with lots of ideas of how to look after those community green spaces for pollinators. And please do add your work onto beelines. You can see on the map there, there's a lot of work on there already, but there is so much going on which is not on the beelines map. So you can go onto our website. There's an interactive map. You can zoom in. You can find your garden, your road verge, your park, your community space that's being managed for pollinators. And you can add your work on there, be it an orchard, a wildflower meadow, a species-rich hedgerow, all of those habitats. We'd love to capture more of that information on beelines. And from the benefits of beelines resource, these are 6 key actions for local authorities. So number 1, first check the beelines map and just look where it's running through your local area, and prioritise wherever possible working with areas on beelines. Ensure that local wildlife sites and nature reserves are being managed well. Obviously, we would love to manage all of our sites as well as possible, but where resources are limited, prioritise those sites within beelines so we have that connectivity on beelines as a minimum. More is always good. Number 3, review the management of green infrastructure. So look at the areas that you're managing and which areas are better, which areas are in a good location in terms of connectivity and being out of the way of conflicting usage, and look at managing those areas better for pollinators. Create wildflower-rich areas in parks, school grounds, roundabouts, wherever you can really. And then number 5, encourage local people to manage gardens and community spaces better for pollinators. Share that resources for community groups. And then create and adopt a pollinator strategy if you haven't already. So no doubt you're doing many of these things, and the next talks will be going more into the detail of how to manage green spaces for pollinators, sharing our experience of what is working and what's happening at the moment. And that's me. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much. Rachel, just shows, if anything, how diverse our pollinators are and all the functions that perform in our system that we rely on. The losses are quite striking, but the good news is there is something we can do about it. So, help us also showcase the work that you are doing by adding them onto the beelines, if possible. Thank you very much, Rachel. I'd like to now hand over to Jim Jeffries from NatureScot, who's going to discuss more about what's happening across Scotland.
Hello everybody, good morning. Hope you can all hear me okay. And thank you very much for the invite to speak today, Rachel. It's fantastic to have an opportunity to talk to so many people who are so interested in doing what we can to help pollinators. I'll introduce myself. My name's Jim Jeffrey. I work at NatureScot and I manage the pollinator strategy for Scotland, along with a small team we have at NatureScot devoted to this work. Now, I hope to cover a fair bit of ground today, touch upon policy, and also look at some projects, but I'm conscious that in 15 minutes, it's hard to cover everything. So the reason I popped my email up there is to say to you, if I touch upon something today that you'd like more information on, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm always happy to talk about pollinators and pollinator projects. Rachel has given us a really good insight into pollinators and pollination, so I will focus on projects, and I'll cover also what we do in NatureScot to support these projects. So if I could have the next slide, please. I think you would imagine that with bumblebees and hoverflies and solitary bees and honeybees being so popular, why on earth are they in trouble? And why do you need a strategy to help them? And the simple fact is that they face a number of challenges, and Rachel's touched upon some of those: land use changing, habitat fragmentation, pesticides, climate change, disease. It's quite a hefty raft of problems facing pollinators. All is clearly not well, and that's why we needed to have a pollinator strategy. And after a significant consultation with a number of interested parties, we launched the Scottish Pollinator Strategy in 2017, and that's running for a decade, and I'm confident there'll be another strategy, another pollinator plan to follow that. Next slide, please. I think the crucial and biggest problem facing pollinators is loss of habitat. I find this particular figure absolutely startling. It's an incredible loss of habitat for our pollinators. And I think we'd have to say that this is something that we can fix here and now. We know what the problem is, we know we're losing habitat, we know what to do to reinstate it. So this is the thing which I think we need to focus our immediate attention on. Next slide, please. So what can we do to help our pollinators? Well, certainly no single organisation, no group, no individual can solve this problem on their own. It really does require partnership working. And we're fortunate in Scotland that we have so many willing partners. Next slide, please. We're very fortunate in Scotland that we have local authorities who take this problem seriously and are addressing it across the length and breadth of Scotland. And given that Scotland has both urban and very rural councils, it's very heartening to see that there is a real momentum behind this drive to help our pollinators. And events such as this one are a great way to share good practice, great ideas, and to get consistency of approach. But things do change over time. Staffing levels change, budgets change, people move into different roles. So we need to have perseverance to address the problems that we face. And NatureScot, I think, offers a continuity with these problems. We are here for the long haul to see the pollinator strategy through. We have our annual conference to share good practice and to bring parties together. We have our annual report, which you can visit on our website. And I think many of you probably are aware of our blog and our X feed, where we share good practice and information about pollinators and pollinator projects, both in Scotland, but also in the UK and indeed Europe and further afield. Next slide, please. So, coming up with projects that attack the problem at landscape scale is really important. We can all do our bit at home in our local community, but doing things at a landscape scale is what will really make a difference. And I'm pleased that we have the Nature Restoration Fund. I put the figures up there for you. And it has two distinct elements. There's a development fund and there's a delivery fund. And the development fund is an opportunity to tease out a project, to find out what needs to be done, to analyse the landscape that you're wanting to alter. And the delivery fund is the actual work on the ground to deliver the project. A good example of the Nature Restoration Fund would be the Tweed Meadows project in the Scottish Borders. It complements Buglife's own pollinators along the Tweed project, and it has very good involvement from local authorities. And again, it epitomises that partnership working and that working at scale. Next slide, please. Another project which is on the go, which I wanted to talk briefly about, is Species on the Edge. Again, it's a large-scale project. 7 landscape areas being affected at scale. 37 species have been targeted. 3 of those are bees, 13 of them are invertebrates. And this project focuses on, as you'd imagine, the name tells you, on the fringes of Scotland. Next slide, please. So partnership working, Rachel emphasised this, and I certainly would want to reiterate that we are fortunate in Scotland to have such a range of really good partners, and we can't do this work individually. We need to pull together. So I've given you a list of some of the organisations who really are helping to deliver the pollinator strategy, and I've listed a couple of the key projects that they are delivering. Next, please. I'd like to talk briefly about the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, encourage everybody to get involved in it. There's still an awful lot we don't know about pollinators, so schemes such as this one are incredibly important to build our knowledge base and to help us target our actions. So if you do have an opportunity, I'd encourage you to not only conduct a fit count yourself, but for those of you who are here representing a local authority, this is something that I feel you can encourage people to do, and it's a good way also to monitor the work that you're carrying out. Next slide, please. Okay, local authorities to me are an absolutely key partner because you're able to act, I think, fairly quickly. I'll not read out the slide, but these are the key things that I see local authorities doing at the moment. I normally at this point actually move seamlessly into a presentation about what's happening in Glasgow, but Carol Maclean is following me here. She'll give the next presentation, and you're in for a treat because Carol is able to demonstrate local authority action that really is making a big difference and really is coordinated. Next slide, please. So I'll now move to stepping through a few of the projects that I'd like to highlight being delivered by our local authorities. First up, Dundee. If you know Dundee at all, there's a road called Riverside Drive, which hugs the Tay as it moves down towards the Firth of Tay. And the council have taken this transport corridor and transformed it by creating a wildflower meadow. And they've got strips of these all along this road. It's a wonderful pollinator-friendly environment. The picture top left, when I took that picture, people were stopping, coming over and taking photographs. And as you can imagine, it was absolutely buzzing with pollinators. It was really, really popular and well used. And I'd like to think that the people who were stopping and looking at these meadow strips would go home and would do something to help pollinators, either in their own garden or in their own community. One of the things that Dundee has really grasped very well, I think, is working with the local community. They work closely with a community group called Bonnie Dundee, and that's been really successful, and that's worked right across the breadth of the city. And not far from Riverside Drive is Nine Wells Hospital, and in the grounds of Nine Wells Hospital, there's a fantastic garden there, which is both a therapeutic garden for patients at the hospital, but also a real boon for pollinators. I've included the slide on the right, which is quite recent actually, just to show you that there is a period, obviously, where wildflower meadows and wildflower intervention doesn't look at its best. And that's something that I think we need to touch upon, the art of communicating to people that we haven't abandoned the land, we are looking after it, but a key part of nourishing a meadow is to cut and to lift it. And I'm sure others will touch upon that in the following presentations. Next slide, please. Stepping into the Highlands, the Highland Council have got a fantastic project, as it says here, Highland Wildlife Meadow Mosaic, and it's made a huge impact across the Highlands in over 90 sites. So places like Lochinver and Betty Hill, they've planted meadows with the help of the local community. And earlier on, when I was speaking briefly about policy, I mentioned the Nature Restoration Fund. And this is another example of a project that's benefited from the Nature Restoration Fund. Next, please. Let's move back down to the Central Belt into Falkirk. And Falkirk Council have what they call Pollinator Parks. And these provide stepping stones through Falkirk and the link up with the John Muir Way. And it's that continuity and that corridor effect that is really important in Falkirk. And I like the picture of this meadow that we've created here because it shows a very natural meadow. It's highly sustainable, and of course it's affordable. And in this day and age, affordability is something that we do have to consider. And I mentioned cut and lift briefly when I showed you the slide of Dundee. It obviously applies to this site here in Falkirk. To keep that meadow looking good, you have to cut and lift it at the end of the season. Next slide, please. I thought we'd nip out to the islands briefly, to Coll and Tiree. What I wanted to mention here was a project that started in Tiree, the Tiree Great Yellow Bumblebee project. It's been highly successful, and indeed it's been so successful that it's now been absorbed into the Species on the Edge project. And I've mentioned the neighbouring Isle of Coll because one of the things I was very taken by on a recent visit to Coll was the fact that the local school in Arinagar had created a meadow outside the school. So what I like to think has happened in Tiree and Coll is that a local initiative has gathered momentum, has snowballed, and it's now delivering something at scale. Next slide, please. This slide here of Lennoxtown, I've included this because I wanted to demonstrate that sometimes we need to practice the art of compromise. And this is an area of football fields, and clearly quite a lot of people would be upset if you dug up the football fields, but there's often a way to get around that by using the land adjacent to amenity grasslands and planting it up. And I think they've done that really successfully in Lennox Town. They've retained the sporting facilities, but they made very good use of the peripheral area around the pitches. Next slide, please. I'd like to finish by moving on to talking about the Ayrshire Nectar Network. I know that Lynn Bates is in the audience. Lynn works for Scottish Wildlife Trust. I've spent a couple of summers now visiting Rachel Down in Ayrshire, looking at the Nectar Network that she's created, and it's an absolutely fantastic facility, a great development. It's wonderful in its own right, but I also wanted to touch upon what Lynn has very successfully managed to do to keep it going and also to expand it at a reasonable cost. Next slide, please. Clearly, people can't and organisations can't keep buying seeds and plants and continually planting. We do have to find an affordable way to keep meadows going and to expand them. And what Lynn's group have very cleverly come up with is a method exploiting green hay to expand the reach of their nectar network. Next slide, please. And this is the gathering of the green hay in action. And what's happening here is Lynn has worked with a group of local farmers to utilise their machinery to cut and lift the meadow, just as the seed heads are in their prime, and to move those cuttings, put them through a muck spreader and spread the seeds onto a new area. So it's a fabulous way to extend the reach of an existing meadow at a fairly cost-effective level. And it's another great example of great partnership working, because Lynn is working with the local council as well as some friendly local farmers. Next slide, please. Perception and communication around meadows is important. I'm sure others will touch upon that. I just wanted to let you know that at NatureScot, we produce this signage, which we can double badge with any local authority or any community group that is embarking upon meadow management. Because, as I showed with the Dundee slide, when you're cutting and lifting, there is a time when a meadow obviously doesn't look at its best. And local residents can be concerned that things have been left to go to rack and ruin. But if you put this kind of signage in and you communicate with the local community, there's a good chance of buying into what you're doing. And the final slide, please. So I've romped through quite a lot of messages there. As I say, I'm happy to continue the discussion both in the chat today, but also by email after the event. Happy to talk about anything that I've mentioned. But I'll leave on a fairly positive note. I think we can make a difference. I think I've demonstrated that there are several local authorities that are making a huge difference. And if we tell the backstory, I think people will buy into what we're doing. So thank you for listening to me, and thank you for the opportunity to join you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Lovely presentation, and nice to see lots of beautiful photographs to inspire us as well. Again, identifying that we know what the problem is and we know what to do about it, but also the importance of partnership working and working at that landscape scale with perseverance, continuity and compromise. This is what I picked up from you, and that way we'll find out the things that we don't know yet, and that we can make a difference. So fantastic. Thank you very much. There has been a couple of questions come up in the chat, which we'll get to later. Maybe if Jim can see them, he can maybe answer them, but if not, we'll come to them at the end. Fantastic. So I'd like to hand over now to Carol Maclean from Glasgow City Council to find out what our Glasgow pollinators are up to. Over to you, Carol. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So yes, I am one of the natural environment officers for Glasgow City Council. So I'm one of the biodiversity officers, and I have a focus on updating, implementing and monitoring the Glasgow Local Biodiversity Action Plan, or LBAP. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd start by setting the scene in terms of our strategies and plans in Glasgow. So Glasgow declared a climate and ecological emergency back in May 2019, and a key action within our Glasgow Climate Plan is the accelerated implementation of the Glasgow LBAP, which helps to achieve action against the decline in nature and also to mitigate against and provide adaptation to the climate emergency through nature-based solutions. So our Glasgow Pollinator Plan sits within the LBAP, and its actions are part of our new delivery plan for the LBAP, which is going to run for the next 5 years. So originally our Pollinator Plan runs from 2017 to 2027. So we've been implementing it for the last 7 to 8 years, and the plan supports the National Pollinators Strategy. So every year we contribute information to Jim for the monitoring of the national strategy. And our Glasgow Pollinator Plan was created in collaboration with Buglife, Butterfly Conservation Scotland, Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and some other organisations. Next slide, please. So these are some of our priority actions for pollinators in Glasgow. Firstly, we have our Buglife bee lines, which run through the north and the south of the city and across some of our best grasslands, our sinks, those are our sites of importance for nature conservation, and our LNRs, our local nature reserves. And of course, these link to the other Buglife bee lines running throughout the other local authorities and across Scotland, hopefully creating connected habitats for pollinators across the city and beyond. We have our nature network. So in the new Scottish Biodiversity Strategy Delivery Plan, there is an action that all local authorities must have their nature network mapped and in place by 2030. So a nature network is currently being mapped in Glasgow, taking in our SSIs, our sinks, our LNRs, and connecting green spaces. And we've been working with the Glasgow and Clyde Valley Green Network to identify those key linkages for our nature network. And finally, we have our Green Connectors project. So as part of delivering on the nature network, our Green Connectors project running 2021 to 2026 is linking up existing habitats with grassland, hedgerow and woodland planting on appropriate green space. And often these are areas of amenity cut or green space which has had limited management. And of course, grassland, hedgerow, woodland creation and enhancement, obviously all great habitats for pollinators and other invertebrates. Next slide, please. So what is our Green Connectors? Well, it's a 5-year funded project, and we were successful in receiving Biodiversity Challenge Fund funding of £120,000 towards year 1. So that allowed us to do wildflower strips, wildflower seeding, nectar-rich bulb planting, hedgerow and woodland, and that connected habitats across 2 areas of the city in Pollock and Nits Hill, and to connect to our Buglife bee lines. It included community engagement via TCV, the Conservation Volunteers, and RSPB. And years 2 to 5 are funded by Glasgow City Council and are continuing similar habitat work across the rest of the city. So we are managing grasslands to become flower-rich meadows. We're improving tree cover to develop copse and woodland habitats. We're creating and maintaining hedgerow and woodland edge as habitats and active travel corridors for wildlife. We're improving and expanding wetland habitats where required, and we're learning from our metropolitan drainage programme and integrated green networks to do so. And we're also trying to deal with pollution using nature-based solutions to reduce air and noise pollution in key locations, and also obviously delivering benefits for pollinators and other invertebrates. Next slide, please. So how are we doing it? Well, first of all, we survey the grassland areas to see what species are already there. And if it's already diverse, we simply let them grow long, and we do a cut and lift at the end of the year. So taking off the arisings and to reduce the nutrient load and allow our wildflowers to flourish. Where the grass is poor in diversity, we're adding bulbs, wildflowers, and in our larger plots, we're also adding hedgerow and trees and woodland with an understory of long grass and wildflowers. So some of these larger plots are included in our annual grassland management contract, which is a cut and lift contract, and others are managed through volunteers. So they strim the grasslands and then they rake off the arisings. In terms of carbon capture, Sustainable Glasgow colleagues have calculated that this project has the potential to sequester over 4 tonnes of carbon dioxide per hectare per year once it's established. And there are also a financial impact of changes to land management. So we expect long-term savings. We haven't yet calculated those, but obviously there are some short-term costs in terms of new cut and lift machinery, seed and contractors. But over time, we think there'll be reductions in manpower and fuel. But our main drivers are the climate and ecological emergencies rather than cost. Next slide, please. So grassland management. We've defined our grassland management into 4 broad categories for maintenance and to support biodiversity. So we have amenity grass. So these are areas maintained as amenity grass to support specific sport, play and recreational activities. And these are cut up to 7 times per year. We have summer cuts for areas identified for informal activity and recreation spaces in parks and larger open spaces in residential areas. And reducing the frequency of cuts and raising the cutting height allows for shorter growing floral species to flourish, providing summer-long nectar resource and caterpillar food. We have seasonal cut and lift, which occurs autumn into winter, either annually, biennially, or on a 3-year rotation. And these are designed to support biodiversity, both flora and fauna, in different ways. So valuable overwintering habitat is created by changes in timing and allows for some plants to complete their life cycle, which would otherwise be prevented if we had continuous or total seasonal cuts. And finally, we have uncut, and that's allowing grass to follow a natural cycle. So this approach is being utilised on slopes and beneath trees. This provides protection to trees from trimmers and other grass cutting machinery, and it provides a winter refuge for invertebrates and pollinators. So to enhance grasslands, bulbs have been mass planted to bring spring colour across the city for people, and also to support our invertebrates and pollinators that are active on the warmer days of spring. So we're trying to get early and late nectar sources in there. We also undertake species enrichment of grasslands through specific planting of wildflower plants. And where we have ponding and constantly wet ground, these areas are being developed as damp meadows, with some enhanced by creating scrapes to hold surface water temporarily. This action is being used to assist local footpath ponding during heavy or constant rainfall. So water taken off paths obviously protects them from frost and ice damage. In grasslands adjacent to existing woodlands, natural regeneration is being allowed to occur. So this natural process allows the trees to seed the grassland over time, allowing habitats to develop in their own way with limited input. So our LBAT partners and volunteers are engaged in working with us in the council to reimagine our grasslands, to encourage butterflies, moths and other wildlife by identifying appropriate sites and developing the enrichment of these into species-rich habitats. Next slide, please. So this slide just shows you a couple of the grass cutting techniques we're using for grassland management. So the council bought 2 Venezia cut and lift machines, which are really useful for larger meadow areas. And we also have scything. So TCV offer training to their volunteers and also to Friends of Parks groups in Glasgow. And then the volunteers scythe at our LNRs, our local parks and green spaces. And again, they rake off the arisings. So it uses no fuel, doesn't damage the environment, doesn't produce emissions or pollution, and provides healthy exercise. So it seems like a win-win, and it's becoming ever more popular. And I think I said, but I'd like to emphasize that, wherever possible, we're leaving winter refuges for overwintering invertebrates. So for example, on large sites, particularly in our local nature reserves, we will only cut half the site, and then the following year we'll cut the other half. So there's always space for caterpillars and chrysalises and so on, but at the same time, we're reducing the possibility of woody plants or docken and so on taking over. And I'll also mention here our Glasgow City Council herbicide policy. So Glasgow City Council has reduced glyphosate use by over 50% since 2012. No herbicides are used in our local nature reserves unless we have non-native invasive species present, and herbicides are not used around the base of trees anywhere in the city. In our green connector sites or along roadsides, only the curb edge is sprayed, and that's just to prevent the grass spreading onto the road. Next slide, please. So, pollinator parks. Designating a pollinator park is an action in our LBAP, and we now have 2 designated parks, Hogganfield Park and Queen's Park in the city. So the Buglife beeline runs right through Hogganfield Park, and we've been enhancing that site for pollinators and other wildlife for many years. Some examples of activities and projects are the Glasgow's Buzzing, where Hogganfield was a key site, involving meadow enhancement trials and a bee bank. We've been undertaking meadow management, some of that for our water voles, creating some lovely meadows. We have naturalisation and floating islands on Hogganfield Loch, and they have nectar sources incorporated into those. There's a Commonwealth orchard, which obviously provides lots of nectar. The Seven Lochs Wetland Park project has put pollinator planters in at the car park, and there is more pollinator planting at shelters in the park, provided by our friends of Glasgow's LNRs and the Seven Lochs project. And we also have done an awful lot of hedgerow creation and management over the years. And there's habitat connectivity, which has been improved by the Avenue End Green Space project and also the Watervole Grassland Management Trial. And that's in addition to existing connectivity to Cardowen Moss LNR, which is close by. At Queen's Park, grass areas have been mapped and further bulb and wildflower planting will be carried out with input invited from the Friends of Queen's Park. So volunteers from the Friends group planted wildflowers last year, and they're kept up to date by email with volunteering opportunities being offered. Our annual biodiversity monitoring report highlights the contributions made by our Friends of Parks groups, and it's circulated to all the groups so that they can see what progress has been made for biodiversity over each year. We're looking to identify further parks as pollinator parks in the future, such as Ruckhill Park in the northwest of the city, which has got fantastic species-rich meadows attracting butterflies such as painted lady. It's also great for moths, with red-necked footman being recorded there and many hoverflies. Next slide, please. So communication. We raise awareness of all the good work being carried out by putting up signage at green connector sites, meadows and other green spaces. So the sign on the left, the Meadow in Progress sign, is based on the All Ireland Pollinator Plan template. And for those of you that don't know, they have a great range of resources which they generously share with everyone. And it's well worth looking at their signage templates, which are very good. So the Meadow in Progress is getting across the message that not all valuable meadows and grasslands are colourful and that new meadows take time to become established. So we want to manage the community's expectations and to reduce any complaints coming into the council. And in particular, we want to provide that information to encourage interest and knowledge building in our local residents and in our communities. The pink sign, which we developed ourselves, highlights pollinators and raises awareness of them, and it also links to the wider themes of climate change and nature-based solutions. So we use this sign in our pollinator parks, and we have a very similar sign to use in our other large meadow park areas. Getting a message across also includes social media. So the Glasgow City Council Twitter feed is good for events, seasonal flowers, meadow strips, and when the bulb planting machine is in operation. We have elected member and community updates through committee reports and updates on the LBAP and the ecological emergency. And I mentioned our LBAP annual monitoring reports. So these are sent to our partnership, they go to council officers, they go to the community groups. And the annual monitoring report, information on pollinators, is sent to Jim at the National Pollinator Strategy. Next slide, please. So that leads us nicely on to community engagement. So we have over 70 Friends of Parks and Green Space groups in the city, carrying out projects from litter picks, promoting their local park, holding events, increasing community cohesion, and this involves a lot of them in tree and wildflower planting for pollinators, because many of the groups are really, really keen on this. For our green connectors, we have a dedicated app for mapping and locations. So that means that communities can use that app to suggest additional sites in their local area where they would like to see wildflowers and meadow creation. We have our Flower Power Nursery, our Hours for Flowers, and this is where local provenance wildflowers from Pollock Country Park and from Scotia Seeds are grown on by volunteers. And if they grow them on, they then get to use them in their local site. So this is run by our countryside rangers, and they see this as a growing your skills. So it's nurturing both people and plants. Lots of benefit for mental and physical health outcomes, as well as for pollinators and meadows. And of course, allotments and community growing areas provide for biodiversity and pollinators in particular through the growing of fruit and vegetables. And in some sites, additional flower planting is designed to support pollinators. So for example, the Grow Chapel project in Drumchapel in Glasgow. And this was a site where there was very little habitat as it was being developed and created, and we're monitoring it over a 5-year period as it develops to see whether biodiversity and particularly insects are increasing as the site plots are developed. Next slide, please. And collaboration. Obviously, the council can't do all this on its own, so we're very much about collaborating with others. We've been collaborating with Buglife for many years, for example, through the Glasgow's Buzzing Project, and also identifying where the beelines should run through Glasgow, and also for our pollinator plan support. So, for example, giving us advice on competition between honeybees and wild bees in terms of our policy note on honeybee hive location in the city. We've worked with TCV for over 15 years in practical conservation tasks in our LNRs, our sinks and other green spaces. And we've worked with butterfly conservation, most recently with the Helping Hands for Butterfly projects in some of our parks, which included wildflower planting, meadow management and ID training for butterflies and moths. And I shall leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. Fantastic presentation. A lot of work being carried out in Glasgow, and it shows a great example of actually how the legislation and policy can be implemented. Also considering the diversity of habitats that can be used to support pollinators as well. And key message I got from that is importantly, see what you have first as a first step and make the management appropriate. But also the short-term costs for long-term savings was also quite important in the scheme of things. And communicating what you're doing, some fantastic community engagement going on as well. Thank you very much, Carol. Again, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat for any of our speakers so far. I'd now like to hand over to Claire Pumfrey, Senior Conservation Officer from Buglife, to talk about some of our work on Strathmore beelines. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that okay? Brilliant. Great. Hi, everyone. Great to see so many people and some fantastic talks so far. Yeah, so I am going to be talking about the Strathmore Beelines project today, people and pollinators in Strathmore. So this project was funded through National Lottery Heritage Fund and the Ganneke Trust. It was a Buglife-led project, which had a 2-year delivery phase from April 2022 to April 2024. And through the project, we created a network for nature across the Strathmore Valley, engaging with local authorities, landowners and communities. In total, 24.8 hectares of wildflower-rich habitat was enhanced and restored across 18 sites. And a big part of the project was focusing on community engagement and running different events and workshops as well to help bring people close to nature and also highlight the importance and diversity of our pollinators. So this is our project area. It's quite a large project area. So it started in Dunkeld in Perth and Kinross and run through to Montrose in Angus. We did work slightly out with the beeline as well to engage with some of those more rural communities and maximise opportunities to working with key towns and villages along the route and within the Strathmore Valley. I really want to focus in on our key relationships with the local authorities. So one of our biggest partners was Angus Council. This partnership worked really, really well. In total, we worked across 10 sites with Angus Council, running from Kirriemuir through to Montrose. And in total, around 3.7 hectares were enhanced for pollinators. A lot of the work focused on wildflower grasslands, but we also included hedgerows and insect banks as well. One thing that was really beneficial from the start of the project was that conversations had taken place before the project had started. And so Angus Council had already started making changes in terms of their managing of sites. They had their Montrose Space for Nature project, so they'd already started relaxing cutting in areas. They'd also invested in cut and lift machinery using their Nature Restoration Fund. So it meant that the sites had already been started to be identified so that when we came into the project, we could start with that communication straight away, getting out the Parks and Green Space team and the different teams to go out and observe and identify the sites for further enhancements if they needed them. So I'm just going to focus on 2 key sites that we worked on with Angus Council, one of them being the Hill in Kirriemuir. Now, at this site, there is already an existing area of wildflower grassland that was being managed as a meadow, so it was having an annual cut and lift. I believe it came about through a combination of relaxed cutting and then also being enhanced through plug plants. So for the first stage, it was really about going out and identifying how the pollinators were using the site already, seeing what flowers were already coming up, and then seeing what opportunities there were to expand on this work. It was really important that we were engaging with the communities around this, getting them involved in the project and making sure that they were on board to see the benefits of doing so and creating more areas for biodiversity and appreciating that biodiversity. So we linked up with Sustainable Kirriemuir to run several events, and we took part in the Kirriemuir BioBlitz, where we recorded a lot of the pollinators in the local area. We also linked up with Sustainable Kirriemuir to run a Pollinators picnic, which was a really big event, actually, a really successful event. And we think that throughout the day, we had around 150 people coming and going to take part in the different activities. So we had bug hunts, we were making bug hotels, there were different craft activities, and it was really successful, and it just kind of brought in the local people to appreciate the local area, which then led on to us being able to propose further areas being created at the site. So we were looking at the opportunities, and you can see from the map here that the existing wildflower patch was quite small, it scalloped into the edge. I mean, it was really supporting pollinators well, but we knew that we could do more to expand on this. So we decided that actually it would be beneficial to create more scalloped areas and expand the wildflower grassland areas to edge along the woodland. This then was also leaving enough area for people to still use the amenity grassland and play and carry out sports, that sort of thing. So it should get the community buy-in. So as other people have mentioned, the first thing to do was to actually observe what was coming up and see what's already existing in the area. So we didn't go straight in with adding in seed and being intensive in terms of our enhancements. We wanted to see what was there. So we marked out the areas, and then that was communicated through the Parks and Green Space team. So relaxed cutting was introduced to these areas in the first spring and summer to see what was growing. And then we were going back and monitoring to see what was happening. The soil on the site is quite thin, and actually there wasn't that much coming through. There was little bits, and we had tomental and bits of devil's bit scabious, but not a lot. So we decided actually we would intervene through adding in more seed. So we were really careful about how we were intervening and what seed we were going to be using at the site. We were monitoring the soil conditions and what was suitable for the area. So an upland grassland seed mix was used from Scotia Seeds that was adapted specifically for this area. So they were native perennial species. Again, we didn't want to go really heavy in terms of disturbing the ground. This can create really big problems in terms of uprooting docks and other problematic species. So we used a power harrow to shallow scarify the surface. So we only went down to between 1/2 inch to 1 inch in depth to create up to 50 to 60% of ground. And then the seed mix was overcast on top of that. I was able to go back and do a quick visit last August. So I didn't do an in-depth survey, but it was nice to see some of the wildflowers coming through. They were still quite short, and again, there wasn't tons of growth, but I think that it's around this creating expectations to know that perennial meadows take time to establish, and so it's about being patient and having that understanding. In terms of future management, it might be that in the first couple of years, because it's such a thin soil structure that it doesn't need a cut and lift. But the advice going on into the future is to carry out an annual cut and lift towards the end of the season. It's also recommended that you vary the timings of the cut. So if you cut from kind of middle of August through to October and vary the timings across the year, it allows different species to set seed, and it creates more of a diverse sward in the structure. Another site which we worked on is the Old Kirk in Montrose. So this is an old burial ground. And this site doesn't have public access, and it was quite a different site. It's obviously difficult to get machinery in, so we had to think carefully, and obviously it's quite a sensitive site about how we approach this. So Angus Council started to reduce the cutting on the area, so they would allow it to grow up throughout the spring and summer. And then it would be cut at the end of the season. So we went in and we monitored to see what was already existing. And as you can see from the photo, there's quite a lot of vigorous grass growth, not a lot of diversity, so we wanted to increase that. So again, we identified the opportunities there for intervening to enhance it for biodiversity, but being careful about how we did that. So we decided it was best to add in some wildflower plug plants, and these were grown by a local nursery for us. And they were selected specifically, again, for the soil type in the area that was suitable for the ground. So we put things like foxglove and wild carrot in, just to add a bit more colour and more diversity that would support pollinators, but also be nice for people to look at when they were passing by. And we also added in yellow rattle and some other pure wildflower seed, just to suppress some of the grasses. And again, we did this slightly different. One way that we found works quite well is to use a strimmer to scarify the surface and then put the seed in then. And just in terms of being able to see what was happening over time after the enhancements. So before there wasn't that much diversity, there was some, it was mostly Yorkshire fog grass. But it was nice to have some of our partners sending photos and go back and visit to see that the yellow rattle that we had sown had come through, and some of those wildflowers had come through as well. So it was really nice to see those enhancements working. And we had a really high percentage of wild carrot come through, which was really, really nice. Another big thing with working with Angus Council was the communication. That was really, really key. We were having conversations along the whole way of the project, always meeting out on site, discussing what was best for the site, but also what was manageable. And it was really about sharing those skills and having an understanding about what was achievable. We decided that it would be of benefit to run a grassing for pollinators workshop. So we held this in partnership with Scotia Seeds at Mavis Bank. And we had a really, really good attendance, and having like the ground staff on board from the beginning, having everyone there to discuss through, you know, best practice and how to approach starting your grassland areas, selecting the appropriate seed if it's needed at all, and also managing the sites and the best way to manage the sites. And for each of our project sites that we worked on, bespoke management plans were produced, and these were given to the council. It very much focused on the works that were carried out, if any, because some sites we actually went and observed and realised that there was quite a good diversity. So it really was just around the management that needed to take place. But then this was all again in the conversations to make sure what was achievable and what was manageable, and the recommendations going forwards for longevity of the project. And overall, just a really good partnership working with Angus Council. I also just want to briefly touch on our work with Perth and Kinross Council as well. So this was a bit more challenging. We were struggling to secure management plans for a number of reasons. But the one way that we were able to ensure that we were able to carry out works on some sites in Blairgowrie and Rattray is by connecting with an existing community group. And I think this is a really good way forward, and I know that others have mentioned it in their talks. So there's Biodiversity Blair that have set up, and they work in partnership with the Ranger Service at Perth and Kinross Council to help with the management of sites in the local area. And one of those sites was the Gamesey. And at this site, there was an area that had been previously sown with a wildflower seed mix, but over years, the management had been taken off, so there had started to become scrub encroachment and also vigorous grass growth. Some areas were still quite nice, but again, through the project, we were looking at reinstating management and how that could work to get the biodiversity back. So again, we identified the opportunities for the site. It was really important that there was a mosaic of habitats, and Carol touched on that, making sure that there were, having those long areas of grassland, so that you've got the overwintering and nesting sites for a lot of invertebrates, but also having those really rich wildflower areas so that it provides a lot of nectar and forage for our pollinators as well. And that's really key. You want to have having a mosaic of habitat, so rather than just having long grass areas, having that forage availability as well. So we identified the opportunities, and we realised that the best approach would be to put in some yellow rattle again to help suppress the grasses, but also add in some wildflower plug plants. And again, the wildflower plug plants was very much focused on what was suitable for the soil type and suitable for the area. So they were perennial species for neutral grass and a lot of MG5 species, so things like knapweed, oxeye daisy, and birdsfoot trefoil that we put in. And again, these were grown for us locally within the project area. And then we carried out a lot of volunteer days to carry out the planting. So we worked with Biodiversity Blair volunteers to carry out planting. The rangers came out at points and helped us with planting. And we also had SEPA come out for a team day to carry out planting for us as well, which was really nice. And I went back quickly but just before the project finished to see how those were doing, and it was really nice to see some of the growth coming through. So there we've got oxeye daisies, yellow rattle, and our yarrow coming through as well. And in terms of management, I think this is what's really beneficial, how it can work with the community groups and with the council working together. The council rangers have an Allen scythe, so they go out and they scythe the area, cut it back, and then the volunteers rake it off. And there's a community garden down the road, so they bring their tractor and trailer. The cuttings get put into the trailer and take to the community garden, where it then goes into composting. We also ran a scything workshop for the volunteers, and we ran ID workshops as well, just to invest that time and the skills into the volunteers. And we were also able to leave some tools with them as well, so that they could help with the future management of the sites. And we felt that this was a really good site to have an interpretation panel. So we developed this design with a local designer, but also with the Biodiversity Blair group and the rangers, so that we could encourage local people to get involved with the volunteering and the future management of the site, but also to know what to look out for at the site, like what pollinators and plants to look for. And just to really touch on lessons learned and challenges, because I think, we've heard a lot of positives, and I think it's important to touch on the fact that, it's not always easy, and that, challenges to arise, and it's about thinking about how you can overcome them. So one of the big ones was around difficulty in securing sites. It was a 2-year project, which actually went really, really quickly. So I would say that one thing that's really beneficial is, if you're developing a project, is to have the conversations before you've got the funding in place, if possible. Develop those relationships, invest that time in those partnerships, having more than one contact, because some people move on to other jobs or different organizations, which is fair enough. So having more than one contact and having those conversations really means that you kind of in the same place from the get-go, and that helps with getting the project off the ground. At times, it was difficult to recruit volunteers to carry out the planting and the management, but again, it comes with investing time into those community groups and providing those training opportunities and getting people really enthused. Things beyond our control, we had extreme weather events, and those things always come into play and consideration. We had to postpone a lot of works. One of our project areas was Brecon, and that was really badly hit by Storm Babette. Obviously, the council at this point needed to deal with the aftermath of that. So we needed to have that flexibility to be able to move things around. And really fortunately for us, we were able to communicate that with our funders, who did give us a short extension so that we were able to get everything done. And again, short-term funding is a challenge in terms of us being able to continue monitoring those sites. And as a partner, that's something that we really want to be able to do. But with limited funding, it means that we often have to then go on to other projects and finish up. But I think, you know, throughout projects, being able to have that time to invest in training opportunities and have those conversations with staff to share skills. So hopefully that people feel confident to continue managing the sites in the long term and recognising when that management maybe needs to be tweaked. And finally, just to finish up, it was a really big project, lots of different partners, so I'm really, really thankful for all of the different partners who were part of the project, and it wouldn't have been possible to achieve it without them. And that's me. Thank you very much. I was aware that I had a lot to say, and I could go on forever, so sorry if I was rushing through it.
Thanks very much, Claire. That just sort of represents the scale of the project, I think. And what's nice to hear is a kind of an honest conversation about things don't always go to plan, and how you overcome them, and having the important conversations beforehand. But also a lot of what you've talked about is making the management site appropriate again, and having a more bespoke way of looking at it. And having that mosaic of habitats also for forage availability, but also invertebrate developmental stages. So thanks very much. Fantastic presentation. Again, there is some questions that have come up in the Q&A. I think, Claire, there might be a couple for you. I see Anne, you've been answering. There's been some from Anne that have been answered as well. But yeah, we'll address them at the end of the session, but please do keep popping your questions in there. Last but certainly not least, I would like to hand you over to Becky Plunket from West Lothian Council to talk about what's happening with our West Lothian beelines. So over to you, Becky.
Thanks. I'll just share my screen. Okay. So I'm hoping you can all see all this. So thank you, Becky. I'm Becky Plunket from West Lothian Council, and I'll be talking today about our West Lothian beelines. These are urban wildflower meadows.
Sorry,
And,
Becky. Sorry, I don't know. Your presentation's not showing on my screen. It's showing someone snorkeling.
Okay. Let me try again. So is this working?
Yeah, can see that now.
Excellent. Good. So brilliant. And is it still working? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes. So yeah, I'll just talk to you today about our beelines project, which is our urban wildflower meadow experience, and it's right from the first ideas of this project to the implementation and also monitoring. So if you don't know, West Lothian is between Edinburgh and Glasgow. Edinburgh over on the east there, and Glasgow on the west, around that area of Bathgate, Broxton, Linlithgow, and we're right between Falkirk and Edinburgh. Oops, sorry. And here's a close-up showing where the beelines come through West Lothian. So we have one running through the north along the John Muir Way, and we also have another beeline running along the River Almond corridor and then out to the west. And you'll see that some of our meadows are actually properly within the beeline, and some are a little bit out. And this is partly around where we can actually implement our wildflower meadows. That's about choosing locations. Okay. So to prepare the way, firstly, we wrote a couple of reports that went through our council's policy and development scrutiny panel. The first report was on wildflower meadows and the benefits of them, and that managed to secure us some council funding to create meadows. And our second report was on how we aim to change management to adopt a more eco-friendly management of open spaces. This gave us the rationale for implementing our changes in grassland management across the council area. We also arranged visits with ground maintenance staff to Fife, Stirling and Edinburgh, and also Falkirk, to find out how other local authorities created and managed their meadows. And this was brilliant, and we're very grateful to everyone for all the advice that they gave us. It's great to see it, other people's meadows in practice. From this fact finding, we then decided that we would create perennial meadows at this point as our. We found that annual meadows were probably going to be more work than we wanted to put in, and also we didn't want to have to start from scratch every year. So the perennial meadows were the way that we decided to go. You can see here the number of meadows we've created throughout the area. In 2019, in partnership with Buglife, we managed to double the funding that we'd secured for through the council that we'd already allocated for urban meadow creation. And we did this by submitting a successful heritage lottery bid, and that allowed us to create 15 urban wildflower meadows, plus community engagement workshops, and crucially some signage as well. We also generated some publicity around this as well, and working in partnership helped us to gain the funding and also helped to give our project some credibility as a local council, to make sure that people knew that we were actually engaged in genuine habitat creation to boost biodiversity. We do have other meadows that weren't created as part of our HLF project. Some were created through park improvement projects, and others were created in more rural locations in the country parks and along the John Muir Way and along the National Cycleway 75 through Sustrans Greener Greenways project. So we've got lots of different meadows created in different ways in different areas. But for the urban parks, which is what I'm talking about today through our beelines, we had lots of conversations with grounds maintenance and our cemetery staff to identify where best to put our meadows from a management perspective. The aim was for us to convert amenity grass, so that's short grass areas, over to meadow for the maximum possible biodiversity benefit. And we also incorporated wildflower meadows into park improvement projects where we could, as we'd be consulting with local communities on these anyway. And some meadows came about after the COVID lockdown, when the grass wasn't cut until about May, June time, and people could see the diversity in the longer grass. And we actually had requests to keep the grass long after lockdown. Oops. So between 2019 and 2021, we created our urban beelines meadows. We did it in two ways. One was to identify the meadows and then employ a local contractor to rotate the areas and seed with a perennial meadow mix. But this can also be a good way to engage communities. So after the ground preparation, in some areas, we scattered seed with communities after the ground had been prepared, and we had 6 habitat creation events like this. So you can see that in these photographs, the perennial seed mixes did also have some annuals in them for the first year with the cornflowers and the poppies. But the annuals do disappear over time, so that's something to think about. And these are the meadows, those same meadows. This is how they look 5 years later, which is very different. These meadows do change over the season with different flowers coming through at different times instead of them all flowering together at once. So you can see the oxeye daisy. We also have knapweed and yellow rattle, which has gone over in the top left slide. So they don't have so many colours at the exact same time, but they do still have good diversity, and they're definitely much better than when they were just short grass. So you can see there for Howden Park, for example, before we put the meadow in, we counted 5 plant species and 0 pollinators. So we definitely have better biodiversity. In these photos, you can also see the contrast in long meadow versus the short amenity grass. And that kind of contrast helps them to look managed, having a margin around them rather than looking abandoned, and it helps to keep the public on side as well. The second management technique we used, or the second meadow creation technique, was where we noticed that the vegetation already looked promising if it might just be left. So, for example, if there was self-heal in the short grass or speedwell, or sometimes we found orchid leaves, we just employed a change in management for these areas and just cutting and lifting once a year. And you'll notice that these meadows do have different species from the seeded meadows. We have a fair amount of buttercup in each, but also ragged robin, stitchworts, self-heal, common spotted orchid. And in the right-hand meadow there, we also have quite a lot of bird's foot trefoil now. COVID meant that our planned training sessions with staff were cancelled in 2020 to 21, but we did manage to get around to doing it in early 2022. And the training sessions included going over the significance of the meadows, why we need to cut and also lift them once a year, the importance of cutting a margin beside paths to make them look neater, but also not severing connectivity with adjoining habitats and just creating little isolated patches. And we found that it's important to keep up this dialogue over time. We have had a few challenges. We've found it best to leave in some wooden stakes for the first few years because we have had accidental cutting of the meadows before people realised what we were, forgot what the plan was for those areas. So the stakes help everyone to remember not to cut the meadows at the beginning of the season, just for the first few years until everyone is familiar with the areas, and also they start to look different as well, even after they've been cut at the end of the season. Most of the posts have been removed now, and some meadows do still get cut at the wrong time by accident, but they do bounce back, so it's not too much of a problem. Also, the time of year, we started cutting in the autumn after the flowering had finished, but this can be difficult as it can be very wet, and in West Lothian we have very clay soils, which means that the ground conditions aren't suitable for the machinery. So we do try to cut a bit earlier now, even if some flowers haven't completely finished flowering. Machinery is also an issue. Cutting meadows and taking the grass to the recycling centre was taking too much time with our smaller cut and lift machinery. So we did consider reducing the size of the meadows, but then with our nature restoration funding, we brought cutting and baling attachments to use with the tractor instead, which copes with the larger amount of green waste. And in fact, now some of our meadows could well be larger. And also some of the challenges are around managing people's expectations and people's perception of our meadows can sometimes be a challenge. So, for example, the Howden Park meadow, which is pictured at the top and the bottom, started off very colourful, but now the plants flower at slightly different times. Overall, it looks slightly less colourful, but it's still very diverse. A few people do think that they do complain, and we have to explain that we're managing the meadows. We are managing the meadows properly, and we are monitoring their diversity as well. This last bit helps quite a lot, actually, the fact that we're actually monitoring the diversity and checking to see how the meadows are performing over time. But mostly people are really supportive of the wildflower meadows, and our grounds maintenance team has been finding that approximately half of their grass-related inquiries now are calling for the grass to be longer and for not to be cut, which is very different to how it was about 10 years ago. So one of the key things that we did want to do after creating the meadows was to measure success. We had to think about what success is. And we feel that the point of our meadows is to increase species diversity in general and to support pollinators. So this is what we wanted to measure and monitor. So we did form a partnership with Edinburgh Napier University and offered research opportunities for MSc students in animal and plant ecology. So far, we've had 2 postgrad students in 2022 and 2023, and they focused on comparing our meadows, so either with each other, so between the meadows that were seeded and the meadows that were just changed the management. And also one of the studies looked at comparing our managed meadows with unmanaged urban sites as well. And we've also set up 4 years of meadow monitoring on 21 of our meadows, urban and rural meadows, across the whole area with Buglife, again, using our nature restoration funding. And we're 1 year into this so far. Buglife also engage communities in this monitoring. They run workshops on invertebrate identification and flower insect time counts. And last year we engaged about 70 children and adults in bug hunts, and we had about 11 participants in the more intense kind of flower insect time count training. The results so far are interesting. To summarise the university research, and we will stress that further research is required, but from the university research, we are seeing what they found was a higher density of plant species in the meadows that were seeded versus the reduced mowing. However, the invertebrate diversity wasn't significantly different between the 2 types of meadow. Site conditions and connectivity do have a significant influence on overall species diversity, and the more isolated sites had less species and also abundance of invertebrates and species. Leaving some uncut refuges each year to maintain the height of the vegetation and minimise disturbance is definitely highly beneficial, even if it's quite a small area. And unmanaged sites do have the potential to be species rich. They can be species rich, although it seems that there are definitely more pollinators, they're more abundant in the managed meadows. And to increase species richness and abundance as a whole, for us, a mix of meadow establishment and management techniques is definitely beneficial. So it's creating that mosaic, as we've talked about earlier. So far, the Buglife monitoring after 1 year is indicating that some meadows are faring better than others in terms of species diversity. The number of species you can see along the x-axis on this graph. The green elements are the plant species and the orangey red bits are the invertebrate species. We've set up transects in each of the meadows so that the species can be counted along the transects each year, and we can compare results from year to year. You can see in the chart that the urban meadows are above and the rural meadows are at the bottom there. In general, the rural meadows are more species rich than the urban meadows. These meadows have never been improved, and they do have good connectivity. And also you see at the bottom there, Scolyburn is a species rich grassland that is a triple SI, so we would expect that to be better anyway. Also, the rural meadows are generally much bigger than the urban meadows as well. Something we'd be keen to explore in the future is looking at species density per metre squared. So we'll think about how we're monitoring the meadows as we go along. Interestingly, Bankton Mains North is clearly an outlier in the urban meadows. It is one of our oldest meadows. It was created in 2017. And it was left for a few years with no management, and we started cutting and collecting again in 2023. So although there's a relatively large number of species here, it might be that there's a low abundance of each species. We don't know because we haven't looked at that. We'll have to see over time. Most meadows would benefit from bespoke management interventions, for example, removing dock. There's potential here for maybe more community engagement in the bespoke management of these meadows as we go forward, and that's something that we're also keen to explore. There's a couple of meadows at the top which look to be some of the least diverse. So that's Livingston Village Park and the Armandvale Civic Centre site. I'll just say something about that. So Livingston Village on the left there does look like a total lost cause, with all the aspen suckers coming through from the woodland adjacent. But last summer we found one or two greater butterfly orchids there. These are a Scottish Biodiversity List species requiring conservation action. So we will continue to manage the area as we have been, and we'll just see what happens over the next few years. And in Armandvale Park on the right there, we also found what we think is a northern marsh orchid. And there's also a lot of common spotted orchids in this location. So this does highlight the importance of monitoring and noticing what you have and where it is. Species diversity is one measure, but also what's really important is the actual species that you do have there. Over the next 3 years, we'll continue to measure our specific 21 meadows across West Lothian and engage communities in various meadow-related activities. We've also written a new amenity grassland management strategy, which proposes an increase in the amount of nature-managed grasslands across West Lothian. And we're including more rain gardens and bulb planting also in urban public spaces, which can help to support pollinators as well. And we do have a lot of actions that will benefit pollinators in our new biodiversity action plan as well. So to sum up, we set the scene with our policy. We did a lot of research and visited other people's sites and looked at other people's sites, and also looked at where was most appropriate for our own meadows in terms of habitat, connectivity, community sport, practical management and logistics as well. We didn't assume that we needed to seed every site. We looked to see what was there. We've engaged the community through publicity, education and awareness workshops, seeding the meadows, monitoring, and through signage as well as social media. We've engaged with our staff, why meadows are important and how we manage them and how important that is as well, and using our markers to make it as easy as possible to remember where the meadows are. We're trying to have annual refreshers and discussions with staff to help continue this conversation. And we're also monitoring and helping to build up a picture of biodiversity in our urban environment, which is helping us to inform management. We're on quite a steep learning curve with this, but it'll help us to assess if management needs changing at all. And we're maximising our support of pollinators by creating other habitats, such as planting trees and creating rain gardens, etc. And finally, we're persevering. It does take a long time to set up meadows, trial them, and to work out what's best for each situation and to bring everyone along with you. There's no quick fix, but as we're seeing with our monitoring and with our feedback from most members of the public, it is definitely worth it.
Thanks very much, Becky. Fantastic talk, and obviously we've been working closely with Lothian Council and yourself over the years, and it's been great to see what's happening with your meadows. It was interesting to the discussion you opened with talking about perennial meadows versus annuals as well, and the amount of effort things take, but also highlighting the few accidents that happened, and you get simple solutions like you put in some stakes to show people signify where the areas are not to be cut, but also having a clear contrast so that the public understand that the site is still being managed. I'm going to move on quickly. We've gone a little bit over, but we do have some questions in the chat that some of them I see have been answered. So I was going to go through a few of these and see if anyone from our panel would be able to give some answers here. Now, there's been a couple to do with what you do with the arisings. We've got a particular one here from Ken. From talking about Aberdeenshire, saying he struggles with disposal of arisings once cut. Being a rural authority, there can be large distances between the sites and the nearest compost area, and it's not always possible to compost on every site. Does anyone have any ways of using this material other than composting? And he's put a suggestion of anaerobic digesters. Would anyone from the panel like to take that question?
I don't think I can answer this fully. I think this is something that comes up regularly. I think it is a challenge, and I don't think there's an easy answer. I know that Becky mentioned investing in more equipment, different equipment to help with that, because you were having the same challenges in terms of the distance that you were traveling. One thing that I will mention, and I guess the local authority is probably a better place to answer this in terms of you're the ones on the ground having to deal with this. But one thing that I want to mention is that I actually visited a friend in the Netherlands who works in across the parks there for the local authority. And one thing that they've been trialing, and I'm not sure how well this will work in certain areas, but one thing that they've been trialing is creating composting bays on site, but in a more natural way. So they plant willow in arches, and they almost create like a kind of bayed area, and then they scatter the arisings within that. And then for a 2-hectare area, I think they said they had 4 of these, but they're creating habitats in themselves by creating these areas. And that's something I'm quite interested in exploring, potentially as a trial with a local authority to see how that might work. But from my understanding is that it kind of closes off, and a lot of the nutrients from the breakdown of the materials then goes back into the willow, and then you've got the living willow growing. So that's just something that I thought I might add. But yeah, I think it might be best place coming from Becky or Carol, maybe.
Can I chip in there? I suppose as a large urban local authority, we find what to do with the arising is a bit of a problem, because they can be contaminated with litter, hypodermic needles, dog waste, and so on, depending on how urban it is. So we do struggle with that. We have a grassland management contract. I think the contractor dealing with that takes the arisings away, but I suspect that mainly goes to green waste. I do know on our smaller sites, if we can, we scatter the arising so they're not taken off site. If we feel that we can do it so that they're not going to be a temptation in drier weather for people to set light or do anything with them, we do try and just scatter that under, say, under the woodland or wherever it's not going to cause a problem. So I'm sorry, again, that's not really an answer. It's something we do struggle with, but it's good to know we're not on our own there.
Thanks very much, Carol. Becky, I think you were going to come in there as well.
Yeah, it is something that we have struggled with as well. And like I said, we did consider reducing the size of our meadows so that there was only one trip from the meadow to the recycling centre instead of several trips with the flatbed. But with the new cut and lift machinery, so it's baling, we cut and bale, and then that can be taken to the recycling centre as well. But yeah, I totally understand that everyone has their own solution to dealing with this issue, but it is an issue and something that everyone does have to think about.
Thanks very much.
I just wanna
Perhaps
add as well, I think, you know, with a lot of the grasslands that are being managed in the meadows, rightly so because of the recommendations of this annual cut and lift, I think, you know, when you think about traditional grasslands, when they are more established and you've got the perennials and you've got finer grasses coming through, there'll be less grass growth and vegetation to have to take away. So again, it's one of those things that takes time. So it might be that perhaps your meadow area needs more than one cut and lift a year in the first kind of few years, which I know again adds to extra volume of waste. But I think over time you should be reducing the amount of growth that's coming through.
that's great. Thanks very much, Claire. Does anyone else from the panel have any more comments they'd like to make on that? Great. I'll pop on to another question. We've got time for a few more.
I think Jeff wanted to say something. Did you, Jeff?
Oh,
Yes, I just wanted to say, Rebecca, I think this demonstrates the value of this kind of forum, because having practitioners talking about the practical challenges that they face is really useful. And there'll be quite a few rural representatives here today. So hopefully that question might spark a bit of debate and lead to some good, good sharing of reasonable practices that are already working.
yeah, absolutely. And I think ideas like Claire suggested as well. I mean, we need to try these new innovative ideas and see if they work, give them the opportunity. Thanks very much. Okay, I'll go into another question here. So this is a question from Anne. This is a question for all projects, especially those within local area, local authority asset areas. How do you manage or progress projects that have a mix of approval, i.e. some very against or complains if it's left as they consider being a mess, e.g. in the graveyards, which is always inevitable not to get 100% buy-in? Would anybody like to approach that? I think, Claire, you'd actually brought that up about having early conversations within your project. Does anyone else from the panel want to speak a bit more about that?
Yes, so we've had some of the similar kind of issues in West Lothian. I think in one particular case that I can think of, we made sure that we were cutting around the area that we'd left, and also cut a path through it so that people could still use the area and go through it. And that helped to make it look more managed as well. But we did get quite a lot of pressure to change the management of it, but because we'd agreed already with a community group that we were going to manage the grass in this particular way, we've kind of stuck to our guns, and we keep managing it in this way, and it's actually got a really good diversity in it, and there's a lot of interesting plants coming through now. So I think it's the key part for us was to make sure we had that margin and the path through it.
Thanks very much, Becky. Any other comments from the panel?
Yeah, I think sometimes you get a small number of community people with a loud voice making complaints, and you can counter that by speaking to the community members that are in favour and asking them to share, their positive comments as well. So, you get a balance of positive and negative comments if you're getting the local community on board in that way, and sharing things on social media, sharing photos of invertebrates and plants that have been seen in that area. So just communicating with the local community, what you're doing and why, increasing the volume of the positive to kind of outweigh those few loud negative people can help.
It's great. Thank Rachel. And I think a lot of our speakers as well have talked about how you communicate and the panels that they use and, you know, getting the information out there. Okay, I'll see if I can grab a few more questions. We do have some questions interested in species lists for plug planting and sowing within Scotland. There is a couple on this. Anyone from the panel like to direct or signpost to answer that kind of question?
Can I say something on that? So it very much depends on your site. So, you know, if possible, do a soil sample, or from just looking at the plants that are present, understand if it's an acidic site, a base-rich site, a more neutral site. So you're then selecting a seed mix which is suitable for that area. We would also generally advise against the use of annuals. So obviously, you know, they're bright and they're colourful and they are a useful resource for pollinators. But you also create this expectation that a wildflower meadow will have reds and blues and all these bright colours in it, whereas native hay meadows, for example, are not that bright and colourful. You know, they have knapweeds and oxeye daisies and vetches and things in them, but they're not quite as bright and colourful. And when you use those annuals, they're present in the first year. And then unless you're disturbing and re-sowing every year, which often involves herbicide, extra money, extra work, they're not going to come back, because these cornflowers and poppies are typically wild plants of arable rotation. So they need that disturbance of the ploughing each year to come back. So rather than creating that expectation that it's going to be red and blue and colourful every year, and then it's not, and you get complaints, we would tend to advise to use the perennials and manage expectations. You know, let people know that the first year you won't get so many wildflowers because they're still establishing. You may have things like yellow rattle in there, which is the meadow maker, which helps to parasitize other plants or knock back some of the grasses and make space for wildflowers. But using those perennial mixes and managing expectations, I think, is the best way long term, if you're then managing that area with cut and lift every year. And, you know, hopefully that will then become progressively species rich. Also, if you have a site in a park, for example, where it's maybe quite nutrient rich already, there are plants that tolerate quite nutrient rich conditions better than others. So again, the knapweed and the oxeye daisy, you know, they're quite bright and colourful. They are native wildflowers. And they can compete that little bit better with some of the more aggressive grasses. But again, our resources do have recommendations on plant lists. What you can also do, if you have a species mix from a provider, you could just look through those flowers, you know, ask a local botanist if you're not a botanist yourself and say, are all these plants actually found growing in our local area? Because some of those wildflowers might be found further south or in a particular soil type. So just check it by a botanist. And try and get those species that would naturally grow in that area.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Fantastic. On that, I think while you're still there, but big on my screen, there's another question from Jo Cook, and she has asked, can anyone recommend the best way to eliminate pernicious grasses, cocksfoot and ryegrass, etc., and ruderals before wildflower seed cultivation?
That's a difficult one. I don't know that we want to eliminate all of them. So cocksfoot, for example, there's a lot of invertebrates associated with that, but you don't want it dominating. So, I mean, the best method that we know really is time and cut and lifting to sort of reduce the vigor of some of those plants. I don't know if other people have other suggestions. We would always avoid the use of herbicides. So we would, you know, cut or dig out. You know, docks can be very challenging. Anybody else got any suggestions?
Come in there just to say what we're doing with our green to nature sites is, you know, as I said, we assess the sites first of all to see what's there. And to be honest, some of the sites where there's a lot of these sort of tougher grasses or ruderals, we are then saying, well, actually, do you know what, we'll put woodland in there or hedgerows, because again, it's, you know, for resources for local authorities, is what can we actually do, what have we got the resources to do, and some sites are actually better put to woodland. And of course, I noticed there was another question about how you protect grasslands. Somebody put something in the chat about woodland versus grassland, and we do protect our valuable grasslands from any sort of woodland planting plans, but for some of those sites where there's rougher grasses, we might say, well, do you know what, that should have a hedgerow in it, or we will allow that to naturally regenerate as woodland.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Carol. That was the next question. So I think you've covered that as well. There's one here from actually Damhead Nature Network as well, to On the Risings. And he said, for some sites, it might be possible to make hay. We do this on Damhead Small Farm with the community through events, and it can add to community learning, and hay can be sold. So I guess that might be another way forwards. We are running out of time. We have please do feel free to get in touch as well. There's some of our presenters have put their direct email contacts up as well, but you can always get in touch with us at Buglife to talk through anything. Let me see if I'll pull one more question. Okay, there's people putting their email addresses. Okay, actually, I think I will leave it today looking at the time we have. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our speakers who've come along today, really showcasing what is possible across Scotland, and also to thank our Buglife team who've put a tremendous amount of work into getting this event organised and all the materials organised as well for it. And to Amy today as well for helping us keep going and giving us a very succinct timeline to work on and a guide on keeping up with the technology. Yeah, so thank you very much for coming along, and please do get in touch if you want to discuss anything that we've talked about today. And we will be looking at a follow-on event as well to keep the conversation going. But yeah, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.